Mm. Liam Fletcher was the running joke of Creston, Montana. In a tight-knit mountain town of barely 900 residents, anonymity is impossible, and eccentricity is treated as a spectator sport. Liam, a retired structural engineer who had moved from Seattle after his wife passed, provided plenty of entertainment. Instead of buying a cozy A-frame near the lake like the other retirees, Liam purchased the Old Miller tract 40 acres of vertical granite and useless scrub pine on the north face of Widow's Peak. Its only defining feature was a massive yawning limestone cavern known locally as the Devil's Throat. When Liam began dragging flatbed trailers full of fiberglass insulation, corrugated steel, deep cycle marine batteries, and miles of PVC piping into the pitch-black maw of the cave, the town had a field day. "You expecting the Russians, Liam, or just a really bad bout of acid rain?" Martha Higgins, the owner of Creston Hardware, would ask with a smirk every time he came in to special order heavy-duty ventilation shafts. Liam would just smile, a quiet, knowing expression that irritated people more than an insult would have. "Just preparing for a rainy day, Martha. Or, more accurately, a snowy one. The historical pressure gradients for this valley are overdue for a hard reset. For 3 years, Liam built his subterranean fortress. He hired specialized drillers from out of state to tap into a subterranean hot spring he'd identified via geological surveys, establishing a closed-loop geothermal heating system. He installed the micro-hydroelectric turbine in the underground river that carved the cave. He built a 3-story, fully enclosed cabin entirely inside the cavern, protected from wind, weather, and the eyes of the town. They called him the caveman. They called him a paranoid prepper. They didn't believe in his cabin in the cave. Until the second week of February 2026, meteorologists on the state news channels were predicting a standard Alberta Clipper, a fast-moving winter storm expected to drop perhaps 8 to 10 inches of snow on the valley. Mayor Richard Abernathy didn't even bother to authorize overtime for the town's 2 snowplow drivers. But Liam saw the signs that the satellites miscalculated. The barometric pressure on his analog gauges didn't just drop, it plummeted off the chart. The behavior of the local wildlife changed drastically. Elk were moving down into the valley in droves, their eyes wide with panic, seeking the lowest possible elevation. On Tuesday afternoon, Liam drove his battered Ford F-150 into town one last time. He walked into the sheriff's office and stood before Sheriff Boyd Harrison. "Boyd," Liam said, his voice unusually urgent, "you need to open the high school and fire up the emergency diesel generators now. Move the elderly in. This isn't a Clipper. It's a stalled polar vortex colliding with a Pacific moisture plume. The models are wrong." Boyd sighed, leaning back in his creaking leather chair. "Liam, I appreciate the concern, but NOAA says it's an 8-incher. I can't justify spending the county's emergency budget because your knees are aching." Liam stared at him for a long, hard moment. "When the grid fails, Boyd, my door is open. But you'll have to walk through hell to get there." It began at 8 p.m., not with snow, but with a sound like a freight train tearing through the valley. The wind had crested with hurricane-force sustained speeds of 70 miles per hour. Then the temperature dropped. It didn't just get cold. The air turned into a physical weapon. Within 4 hours, the thermometer outside Martha Higgins' store plummeted from a mild 28 degrees Fath to 25 degrees Fath. Then the snow started dense, blinding, and horizontal. At 2:14 a.m., the main power substation at the edge of town, battered by ice accumulation and screaming winds, exploded in a shower of blue sparks. The entire town of Creston plunged into absolute darkness. For the first 24 hours, people treated it like a severe but manageable inconvenience. Families huddled under blankets, lit candles, and listened to the howling wind. But as Tuesday bled into Wednesday, the reality of the crisis set in. By Wednesday evening, the ambient temperature outside was 42 degrees Fath. With the wind chill, it was close to 70 degrees Fath. The cold began to conquer the town. In the home of Tom and Sarah Gallagher, the pipes burst violently, instantly freezing and turning their living room into a jagged ice rink. Their 8-year-old daughter, Lily, was shivering uncontrollably, her lips a terrifying shade of blue. Sheriff Boyd Harrison, wrapped in 3 layers of Carhartt gear, tried to coordinate a response using his cruiser's radio. The town's backup plan, the high school gym, was failing. The heavy snowpack, accumulating at an astonishing 3 inches an hour, was causing the flat roof of the gymnasium to bow inward with terrifying groans. The diesel generator, thick with cold-sludged fuel, sputtered and died. "We are going to die," Mayor Abernathy whispered through chattering teeth over the radio frequency to Boyd. "The school is freezing. People are getting frostbite inside their own homes." Boyd stared out the frosted windshield of his cruiser. The snowdrifts were 6 feet high. The town was a tomb. "When the grid fails, Boyd, my door is open." Boyd grabbed his radio. "Richard, gather everyone you can at the church. Anyone who can walk, wrap them in everything you have. Mylar, sleeping bags, carpets. We have to move." "Move where, Boyd?" "The roads are gone." "To the devil's throat," Boyd replied grimly. To the caveman, Thursday morning offered no sunlight, only a gray, swirling void. Over 200 terrified, freezing residents gathered at the First Presbyterian Church at the edge of town. They were a pathetic sight, a procession of ghosts wrapped in mismatched blankets, snow goggles, and fear. The journey to Widow's Peak was only a mile and a half, but in waist-deep snow and 40 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures, it was an Everest expedition. Deputy Carl Jenkins took the lead, using snowshoes to break a trail. Behind him came the Gallaghers, Tom carrying little Lily wrapped inside his own coat, pressing his body heat against hers. Martha Higgins, her usual sarcasm frozen solid, clung to Mayor Abernathy's arm just to stay upright. The wind tore at them. The air was so brittle it felt like inhaling crushed glass. It took them 3 agonizing hours to ascend the lower ridge. 4 elderly residents had to be carried. Boyd's face was entirely numb, his eyelashes frozen together. Finally, the gaping black mouth of the devil's throat loomed out of the whiteout. "We made it," Tom Gallagher rasped, his voice barely a whisper. They pushed into the cavern. The wind instantly died, blocked by the natural rock formation, but the ambient temperature inside the mouth of the cave was still well below 0. Boyd clicked on his heavy-duty flashlight, sweeping the beam across the massive cavern. There, built into the rock walls, was Liam's cabin. It was an architectural marvel of corrugated steel, reinforced timber, and thick, insulated glass. A soft, warm amber light spilled from the windows, but something was terribly wrong. The heavy steel-reinforced door at the front of the cabin was wide open. Snow had drifted into the entryway. "Liam!" Boyd yelled, his voice echoing off the limestone walls. Silence. The townspeople rushed forward, crowding into the entryway of the structure. The inside of the cabin was a miracle. It was 68 degrees. The air smelled of damp earth and growing green things. Boyd pushed past the entrance, leading a small group. "Spread out. Find him." They found Liam Fletcher not inside the cozy living quarters, but in the adjoining utility tunnel near the back of the cave. He was pinned beneath a massive section of the cave ceiling that had fractured from the extreme sudden temperature shifts outside, contracting the rock. A slab of limestone weighing easily 1,000 pounds lay across his lower legs. He was unconscious, his skin pale, his pulse thready. He had clearly been trying to clear an ice blockage from one of his external air intake valves when the rock gave way. The twist of fate was sharp and immediate. The town had come to beg the outcast for salvation, only to find that the outcast desperately needed them. "He's alive, but barely," Tom Gallagher shouted, dropping to his knees. "We need leverage now!" The very people who had mocked Liam's paranoia now worked with frantic, unified purpose. Mayor Abernathy, Deputy Jenkins, Boyd, and 5 other men grabbed heavy steel pry bars and timber beams from Liam's meticulously organized workshop. "On 3!" Boyd roared. 1, 2, 3. With a synchronized groan of exertion, the men leaned their combined weight onto the makeshift levers. The massive limestone slab ground upward, shifting just enough for Martha Higgins and Sarah Gallagher to drag Liam's limp body out from underneath. They carried Liam into the main living area, laying him on a massive leather sofa. As the townspeople filtered into the structure, awe replaced their terror. Liam hadn't just built a cabin, he had built a self-sustaining ecosystem. The climate, the closed-loop geothermal system pumped naturally heated water through radiant flooring, keeping the massive space comfortably warm without a single open flame. The light, banks of deep-cycle marine batteries, charged by the underground river turbine, powered rows of full-spectrum LED lights. The food, the entire second floor, was a hydroponic greenhouse. Rows of tomatoes, kale, potatoes, and beans grew in nutrient-rich water channels, providing fresh oxygen and a psychological boost of vibrant green life in the dead of winter. Sarah Gallagher, who had worked as an ER nurse before moving to Creston, took charge of Liam. His legs were severely bruised, perhaps fractured, and he was suffering from hypothermia, but the heavy insulated Carhartt bibs he wore had prevented the rock from crushing his bones entirely. For the next 48 hours, the blizzard raged outside. The town of Creston was buried under 64 inches of snow. Homes were destroyed, power lines were snapped like dry twigs, and the high school roof eventually caved in completely. But inside the Devil's Throat, 200 people survived. They organized rationing of Liam's immense pantry of freeze-dried goods. They rotated sleeping shifts. They watched over the man who had built their sanctuary. On the afternoon of the 5th day, Liam finally opened his eyes. He blinked against the warm LED light. The first face he saw was Sheriff Boyd Harrison holding a mug of hot coffee. Sitting on the floor nearby, drawing on a piece of scrap paper, was little Lily Gallagher. The cabin was filled with the soft hum of quiet conversation and the ambient warmth of human bodies. Liam winced as he tried to shift his legs. "Well," he croaked, his voice dry, "I see you found the spare key." Boyd let out a short, breathy laugh that sounded suspiciously like a sob. "Door was open, Liam. Good thing we showed up, or you would have frozen to death in your own fortress." Liam looked around. He saw Mayor Abernathy carefully tending to the hydroponic tomatoes. He saw Martha Higgins ladling hot soup out of a massive crock-pot in the industrial kitchen. For all his brilliant engineering, Liam realized a fundamental flaw in his design. He had built a system to survive the end of the world entirely alone, but when the mountain had unexpectedly shifted, all the geothermal heat and battery banks in the world couldn't lift 1,000 pounds of rock. "I built it for a rainy day," Liam whispered. "It snowed, Liam," Boyd smiled gently. "And we're sure glad you did." On day 6, the storm broke. The sky over Creston cleared to a brilliant, piercing blue. The National Guard arrived in heavy-lift helicopters 2 days later, expecting to find a town of frozen corpses. Instead, they found a community climbing out of a cavern on Widow's Peak, alive, warm, and irrevocably changed. The town of Creston took years to rebuild. The grid was modernized, the homes were reinforced, but the social fabric of the town was altered forever. Liam Fletcher was no longer the crazy prepper of the Devil's Throat. He was the architect of their survival, a quiet hero who ended up running the town's newly formed Civil Defense Committee. Nobody ever mocked the cabin in the cave again. In fact, when Liam finally decided to expand the greenhouse, the entire town showed up to help him carry the materials up the mountain.